The black SUVs tore through the rain-slicked streets of Gangnam at 90 kilometers an hour, tires screaming against wet asphalt as gunfire erupted from the motorcycle behind them. Glass exploded across the back seat. Kang Tae-Joon threw himself sideways as a bullet tore through the headrest where his skull had been a half-second earlier. "Get down! Get down, sir," his driver screamed, wrenching the wheel as another SUV flanked them, spraying automatic fire into the night. Tae-Joon pressed his palm against the wound in his shoulder, blood seeping black between his fingers in the dim green glow of the dashboard. He had survived 4 assassination attempts in 30 years. He had buried men who tried to kill him and men who tried to protect him in the same week. But something about tonight felt different. His hands, usually steady even with a gun pointed at his face, were shaking. "Lose them," he growled through clenched teeth. "Lose them now." The driver cut the wheel hard right, sending the convoy screeching down a side alley barely wide enough for the vehicle. Sparks flew as the side mirror scraped concrete. Behind them, the motorcycle skidded, overcorrected, and slammed into a parked delivery truck in an explosion of metal and fire. For a moment, silence. Then Tae-Joon's vision blurred. His chest tightened. A pain unlike the bullet wound spread from his temple down through his spine, and his hand slipped from the seat. "Sir? Sir," the driver shouted, glancing back in horror as the most feared man in Seoul's underworld slumped against the door, eyes rolling back, lips moving without sound. By the time they reached the private hospital wing his organization owned outright, Kang Tae-Joon was unconscious, his body convulsing from what the doctors would later diagnose as a sudden acceleration of a neurological illness he had been hiding for 2 years. The bullet wound was minor. What the ambush had done to his brain was not. He woke 3 days later to white ceiling tiles and the low murmur of machines. His right hand would not close into a fist no matter how hard he willed it. When he tried to speak, the words came out slurred, as though his tongue belonged to someone else. The doctor did not meet his eyes when he delivered the news. "The trauma has accelerated the progression significantly, Chairman. We're looking at declining motor function, and the tremors will likely worsen. I won't lie to you. 6 months ago, we were managing this. Now we're trying to buy you time." Tae-Joon said nothing. He simply stared at the ceiling and thought of every man he had once broken with a single glance, and how none of them were in the room with him now. For 3 decades, the name Kang Tae-Joon had made grown men empty their bank accounts and disappear from the country overnight. Politicians took his calls before their own wives. Judges quietly filed away cases that bore his fingerprints. They called him the Tiger of Korea, not because he roared, but because by the time you heard him coming, it was already too late. Now, he could not lift a teacup without his hand betraying him. Word spread through Seoul's underworld the way oil spreads across water, quiet, fast, and impossible to stop. The tiger is dying. The empire is up for grabs. Rival syndicates that had cowered under his shadow for years began testing the borders of his territory within days. A shipment that should have crossed the Busan docks untouched was seized by a rival faction without so much as a phone call of warning. A restaurant that had paid protection money to the Kang organization for over a decade quietly switched allegiance overnight. Old debts that no one dared mention were suddenly being called in. And inside the walls of his own mansion, something far colder than any rival gang was beginning to stir. His second-in-command, a loyal enforcer named Park Jae-sung who had taken a bullet for Tae-Joon twice in his career, came to the mansion within days of the ambush, kneeling beside the bed with genuine anguish carved into his weathered face. "Say the word, sir," Jae-sung said, voice low and urgent. "Give me a name, and I will handle whoever did this. I will not rest until they are found." Tae-Joon, barely able to lift his own hand from the blanket, managed only a slow shake of his head. "No retaliation. Not yet. Find out who ordered it. Quietly. I want to know before I decide what to do about it." But even loyalty like Jae-sung's had its limits against the tide of an empire that smelled blood in the water. Within 2 weeks, calls to the organization's usual contacts went unanswered. Meetings were postponed, then canceled outright. The machinery Tae-Joon had spent 3 decades building, oiled by fear and enforced by his own iron will, began seizing up the moment the man at its center could no longer personally guarantee the consequences of crossing him. If you're loving the tension already, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story only gets more intense from here. Let's get into it. The Kang estate sat behind 12-foot walls in the hills above the city, a compound of glass, marble, and quiet menace that had once buzzed with the constant hum of business. Men in dark suits moving through hallways with envelopes and encrypted phones, deals worth more than some countries' GDPs settled over tea in the sunroom. Now the halls were still. Guards stood at their posts out of habit rather than purpose. The staff moved like ghosts, speaking only when spoken to, careful never to look too long toward the east wing, where the master of the house now spent his days trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. His 3 children gathered in the mansion within a week of his collapse, though none of them came for him. Kang Min-ho, the eldest son, arrived first, immaculate in a charcoal suit, his face arranged into an expression of practiced concern that fooled absolutely no one who had known him longer than 5 minutes. He walked the halls of his father's mansion, like a man already measuring the drapes. "How is he today?" he asked the head of household staff, a wiry old man named Choi Byung-chul who had served the family for over 30 years. "The same," Byung-chul answered carefully. "Weak." "Good," Min-ho said, before catching himself. "I mean, has the doctor said how long we're looking at?" Byung-chul's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned decades ago that the safest words in this house were the ones never spoken. Min-ho's younger sister, Kang Ji-woo, arrived 2 days later with a leather folder full of documents that had nothing to do with her father's medical care and everything to do with which foreign buyers might be interested in certain off-book family assets, should control of the organization change hands sooner rather than later. Her younger brother, Kang Do-yoon, barely 26 and already drowning in debts from a lifestyle his father's money had spoiled him into, had begun quietly meeting with rival syndicate leaders, offering pieces of territory that were not yet his to give away in exchange for protection once his father was gone. Not one of them sat by his bedside longer than the time it took to be seen doing so by the household staff. One evening, the 3 siblings gathered in the study for the first of what would become many closed-door conversations, the heavy oak doors doing little to muffle their voices from anyone who lingered nearby with a reason to listen. "He could be like this for years," Diyun said, pacing in front of the cold fireplace, agitation radiating off him like heat. "Years, and none of us can touch a single account until he's actually gone. Then we make sure the transition is smooth when it happens," Min-ho said coolly, seated in their father's own leather chair as though he had already claimed it. "I've already had preliminary conversations with the board about restructuring." "You had conversations without us?" Ji-woo's eyes narrowed. "I had conversations that protect all of our interests," Min-ho corrected. "Someone needs to be thinking ahead. Father certainly isn't capable of it anymore." "He's not dead yet," Ji-woo said, though the words carried none of the weight they should have. "No," Min-ho agreed, swirling the whiskey he'd poured himself from their father's private cabinet. "But let's not pretend any of us are here, because we're worried about him recovering." Nobody in the room disputed it. He built an empire. Byung-chul murmured to himself one evening, watching Ji-woo leave without so much as glancing toward her father's door, and raised nothing but vultures to inherit it. Across the city, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a noodle shop in a far less glamorous part of Seoul, Amina Johnson counted the last of her cash on the kitchen table for the 3rd time that night, as though the numbers might change if she willed it hard enough. They did not. Her 2-year-old son, Noah, sat on the floor nearby, driving a plastic dinosaur across the linoleum and making engine noises with the kind of joy that only a toddler could summon in a room this small, this cold, this close to empty. "Mommy, Dino wants food," Noah announced, holding the toy up toward her. Amina forced a smile she did not feel. "Dino's gonna have to wait his turn, baby. Mommy's still figuring some things out." She had moved to Seoul 6 years earlier on the promise of a stable nursing position and the kind of fresh start that America hadn't been offering her back in Chicago. For a while, it had worked. She'd built a life here, a real one, with co-workers who became friends, a modest apartment she was proud of, and eventually, Noah, The single best thing to ever happen to her, even if his father had made it clear within weeks of finding out about the pregnancy that fatherhood wasn't a role he intended to play. Then the hospital downsized. Budget cuts, they called it. Amina called it the beginning of the hardest year of her life. She'd taken whatever work she could find since, translation gigs, retail shifts, a brief and miserable stint doing customer service for a company that fired half its staff by email. Nothing stuck. Nothing paid enough. And now, with rent due in 11 days and less than half of it sitting in her account, she was running out of both time and options. Her phone buzzed. A message from the staffing agency she'd registered with weeks ago, more out of desperation than hope. Urgent placement, private household, live-out housekeeping staff needed immediately. High pay, immediate start. Discretion required. Amina read it twice. Discretion required usually meant something she didn't want to know about. But high pay was high pay, and 11 days was 11 days. She called the number before she could talk herself out of it. The woman on the other end was brisk, professional, and gave almost no information beyond an address, a start time, and a warning that felt more like a threat than advice. Once you're hired, you don't discuss the household. Not with friends, not with family. You understand. I understand, Amina said, though she didn't, not really. Her babysitter canceled the next morning without warning. A family emergency, she said, voice apologetic through the phone, leaving Amina exactly 0 options for childcare on the day of her interview. She stood in her bathroom mirror, dressed in the only blazer she still owned that fit properly, and stared at her own reflection like it might offer a solution. It didn't. Noah, standing in the doorway clutching his dinosaur, looked up at her with the open, trusting eyes only a child that age could give. We going somewhere, Mommy? Amina crouched down and fixed his little collar, more to steady her own hands than his. Yeah, baby. We're going somewhere. You gotta be my best helper today, okay? Real quiet, real good. I'm always good, Noah said solemnly, which made her laugh despite everything. She thought back, driving through the quiet morning streets with Noah babbling happily in the back seat, to the life she'd imagined for herself when she first landed in Seoul 6 years earlier. Young, ambitious, certain that hard work and a nursing license would be enough to build something stable on her own terms, 3,000 miles away from the disappointments that had followed her out of Chicago. She had loved this city once, before it started feeling like a maze of closed doors. She still loved Noah more than she had ever loved anything, but some nights, lying awake doing math on rent and formula and daycare she couldn't afford, she wondered if she'd made a mistake staying here at all, so far from family, so far from anyone who might catch her if she fell. You okay, Mommy? Noah asked from the back seat, apparently sensing the shift in her mood the way small children sometimes did, with an intuition that had nothing to do with words. I'm okay, baby, Amina said, forcing warmth back into her voice. Just thinking. Thinking makes your face sad, Noah observed. She laughed despite herself, glancing at him in the rear-view mirror. You're too smart for 2, you know that? I'm almost 3, Noah corrected proudly, holding up 2 fingers and then, after a moment of concentration, a third. She had no other choice. She strapped him into his car seat, drove the 20 minutes into the hills above the city, and tried not to think about what kind of household needed this much discretion and this much money for a housekeeping job. The gate alone should have told her. It rose 15 feet into the air, wrought iron reinforced with steel, flanked on either side by men in dark suits who did not smile, did not speak, and did not take their eyes off her car for a single second as she pulled up. One of them approached her window with a flat, practiced calm of someone who had been trained to notice threats before they became threats. Name, he said. Amina Johnson. I'm here about the housekeeping position. He glanced past her, into the back seat, where Noah sat kicking his feet and humming to himself. Something flickered across the guard's face, surprise, maybe, or concern, before he keyed something into a radio and waved her through. The mansion that rose up the long driveway looked less like a home and more like a fortress dressed up in marble and glass. Amina had grown up in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago. She'd seen wealth before, but never like this, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, because the walls did the talking. Armed men stood at intervals along the property, trying and failing to look like ordinary security. Every window she could see was tinted dark. Somewhere behind that glass, she thought, someone was watching her arrive. Inside, a stern older woman named Park Sun-hee, who ran the household staff with the efficiency of a military officer, walked her through the basics without a hint of warmth. Cleaning schedules, areas she was permitted in, areas she was absolutely never permitted in. The East Wing, upper floor, Sun-hee said, stopping in the middle of the hallway and turning to face Amina directly for the first time. You do not go there. Not to clean, not to deliver anything, not for any reason. Do you understand? What's up there? Amina asked, immediately regretting the question when Sun-hee's expression hardened. The master's private quarters. He is unwell. He does not receive visitors, and he does not tolerate interruptions. She glanced down at Noah, who was tugging at Amina's sleeve, restless from the long car ride. And the child cannot be left unsupervised in this house. Do you understand the seriousness of that? Yes, ma'am, Amina said quickly. He'll stay right by me. I promise. Sun-hee studied her for a long moment, clearly still deciding whether hiring a single mother with a toddler in tow had been a mistake, before finally nodding and continuing the tour. Amina followed, gripping Noah's small hand a little tighter than necessary, trying to ignore the way her stomach twisted every time they passed a guard, every time she caught a staff member glancing nervously toward the staircase that led to the forbidden East Wing. Never enter the master's room. She would hear some version of that warning at least 4 more times before her first shift ended. She had no idea, standing in that gleaming hallway with her son's small hand in hers, that the warning would matter to exactly no one in this story more than it mattered to Noah. 2 days into the job, exhausted from scrubbing floors that were already spotless and organizing closets no one seemed to actually use, Amina made the mistake every working parent eventually makes. She let her attention slip for less than 60 seconds while restocking supplies in a hallway linen closet. 60 seconds was all it took. Noah, bored of sitting quietly and drawn by the pull of a long, unfamiliar hallway, wandered off toward the grand staircase at the end of the corridor. He climbed it the way toddlers climb everything, slowly, one small victorious step at a time. Dinosaur toy clutched tight his fist and reached the top before anyone noticed he was gone. Noah. Amina's voice cracked as she stepped out of the closet to find the hallway empty. Noah. She ran toward the staircase, heart slamming against her ribs, and reached the top just in time to see her son's small figure disappear through a set of double doors at the far end of the East Wing. The doors to the master's private chambers. Noah, no. Amina broke into a sprint, but 2 guards were already moving toward the doors from the opposite direction, hands rising to their earpieces, faces tight with alarm. She reached the threshold half a second behind them and froze, breath catching in her throat, certain she was about to witness her son's last moment of childhood innocence before something terrible happened. Inside, propped up against a mountain of pillows in a bed far too large for the shrunken man occupying it, Kang Tae-Joon looked up from where he'd been staring blankly at the wall for the better part of 3 hours. A small child stood at the foot of his bed, staring back at him with wide, curious eyes. Are you sick? Noah asked, tilting his head. Tae-Joon's mouth opened, but nothing came out. No one, not his doctors, not his own children, not a single soul in this house, had spoken to him so plainly, so directly, in longer than he could remember. Everyone else tiptoed. Everyone else measured their words like they were defusing a bomb. This child simply asked, "Are you lonely?" Noah continued, climbing without permission onto the edge of the enormous bed, dinosaur toy dragging along the silk sheets behind him. The guards in the doorway exchanged a horrified glance, hands hovering near their radios, waiting for the explosion they were certain was coming. Amina's whole body had gone rigid with panic, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other reaching instinctively toward her son, even though she was still too far away to grab him. Noah, baby, come here right now, she whispered, terrified to raise her voice in a room that felt like it might shatter at the wrong sound. But Noah wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at the old man in the bed, whose eyes, pale, tired, rimmed with exhaustion no medicine could touch, had filled, impossibly, with something that looked almost like tears. "Here," Noah said, holding out his dinosaur toy with both hands, the way children offer their most prized possessions to people they've decided, for reasons only they understand, deserve them. "He makes sad people happy. You can have him." For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the room moved. Nobody breathed. Then Kang Tae-Joon, the man who had ordered the deaths of rivals with less emotion than most people order coffee, the man whose own children had not managed to make him smile in over a decade, reached out with a trembling hand and closed his fingers gently around the small plastic toy. And he smiled. It was small, and it was crooked, and his trembling hand could barely hold the toy steady, but it was real. It was the first genuine smile anyone in that mansion had seen on his face in years, and every guard in that doorway, every staff member who would hear about it within the hour, understood instantly that something in this house had just shifted, irreversibly, in a direction none of them could have predicted. "Get him out," one of the guards finally managed, stepping forward. "Get the child out now." "Stop." Tae-Joon's voice, though weak and slightly slurred, carried enough of its old authority that the guard froze mid-step. Even sick, even dying by every measure his doctors could offer, the Tiger of Korea's voice still had teeth. "Leave us," Tae-Joon said, eyes never leaving the toddler perched on the edge of his bed. "Sir, protocol requires." "I said leave." The guards exchanged one more uncertain glance before backing out of the room. Amina remained frozen in the doorway, torn between the instinct to snatch her son to safety and the strange, electric stillness of the moment unfolding in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed, stepping forward with her hands raised, placating. "He doesn't know any better. He's only 2. I'll get him right now, and it will never happen again, I swear." "What is his name?" Tae-Joon asked, ignoring her entirely, his eyes fixed on the boy. "Noah," Amina said, thrown off balance. "Noah Johnson." "Noah," Tae-Joon repeated, testing the word like it was unfamiliar territory. He looked down at the dinosaur in his shaking hand, then back up at the child. "Thank you, Noah, for the gift." Noah beamed, delighted, apparently unbothered by the fact that he had just wandered into the private chambers of one of the most dangerous men in the country and lived to tell about it. "You're welcome. You should smile more. It's good for you." Somewhere behind Amina, she thought she heard one of the guards choke back something that might have been a laugh. She wasn't laughing. She was doing the mental math on how fast she could pack up their lives and disappear from the city entirely, certain that this, whatever this was going to end with her being fired, or worse, before the week was over. Instead, Tae-Joon looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived in this house, his expression softened into something almost human. "Bring him back tomorrow," he said quietly. "Sir, I don't think." "Bring him back tomorrow," Tae-Joon repeated, an edge returning to his voice that made it clear the request was not, in fact, a request. Then softer, almost to himself. "Please." Amina swallowed hard and nodded, scooping Noah up despite his protests, murmuring apologies all the way out of the room, her mind racing through everything son he had told her about never setting foot in the East Wing, about discretion, about the seriousness of working in this house, and wondering, with a growing sense of dread, exactly what she had just gotten herself into. If this story's already got your heart racing, drop a comment below and tell me what you think is really going on in that mansion, because trust me, this is only the beginning. And don't forget to like this video before we continue. What began as an accident became, within days, a routine that nobody in the household could quite explain and nobody dared question out loud. Every afternoon, once his medications had been administered and the household had settled into its usual hush, Kang Tae-Joon asked for the boy. At first, Amina brought Noah reluctantly, terrified of overstepping, terrified of the consequences if this arrangement soured even slightly. But Tae-Joon's mood on the days Noah visited was so markedly different from the vacant, hollow silence that had defined him since the ambush that even Sunhee, stiff and disapproving as she was about the whole arrangement, could not bring herself to end it. Noah told him stories that made no logical sense and somehow felt profound anyway. Long, meandering tales about dinosaurs who fought monsters and then became friends with the monsters, about a superhero named Captain Noah who protected old people from being sad. He showed Tae-Joon, with great ceremony, exactly how to stack wooden blocks into a tower so it doesn't fall down. See, you gotta go big to small, and celebrated with genuine, uncomplicated joy every time the old man's shaking hands managed to place a block without toppling the whole structure. You did it! Noah shrieked one afternoon, clapping so hard he nearly fell off the bed, as Tae-Joon successfully balanced a small red block atop a wobbling tower of 6 others. You're so good at this. Tae-Joon laughed. Actually laughed, a real, rough sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised the nurse standing quietly in the corner of the room, who nearly dropped her clipboard at the sound of it. I built an empire worth more than this entire district, Tae-Joon said, mostly to himself, staring at his small, imperfect tower of blocks like it was the greatest achievement of his life. And this is the first time in years I've felt like I've actually accomplished something. Amina, standing near the door as she always did during these visits, unable to fully relax even as the days passed, caught the words and felt something in her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe. Or recognition. She knew what it was like to feel invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to care about you. The doctors noticed the changes before anyone else was willing to say them out loud. Tae-Joon's appetite, non-existent for weeks, began to return. His blood pressure, dangerously unstable since the ambush, started to level. He actually slept, deep and dreamless, for the first time since his collapse, and woke asking not for updates on the empire he was losing control of, but for word on when the child would visit next. It's remarkable, his primary physician admitted to a colleague one evening, reviewing charts that showed genuine, measurable improvement no medication could fully account for. Whatever's happening with this child, I've never seen anything accelerate recovery like this. It's not medical. It's something else entirely. One afternoon, Noah arrived clutching a crayon drawing instead of his usual dinosaur, holding it up proudly for Tae-Joon's inspection. It was, as far as Tae-Joon could tell, 3 overlapping circles of varying size, one purple, one orange, one a color that didn't exist in nature at all. That's you, Noah announced, pointing to the largest circle. That's me. He pointed to the smallest. And that's Mommy. He pointed to the one in between, beaming as though he'd just unveiled a masterpiece. It's beautiful, Tae-Joon said, and meant it more than he'd meant almost anything in years. May I keep it? You have to put it somewhere important, Noah instructed solemnly. Not in a drawer. Somewhere you can see it. That evening, for the first time in the mansion's long history, a child's crayon drawing was mounted in a simple frame and hung on the wall of Kang Tae-Joon's private study, directly across from the desk where he had once signed documents that ended men's lives with the same steady hand that now could barely hold a pen some mornings. Staff who entered the room on business found themselves staring at it longer than they meant to, unable to reconcile the incongruous warmth of 3 overlapping circles with everything else that room represented. Amina noticed it the first time she came in to check on him and felt something in her chest tighten, unexpectedly, at the sight of it. You really hung it up, she said. He told me to put it somewhere important, Tae-Joon said simply, as though that explained everything, which, to him, it did. Word of the change did not stay contained to the medical staff for long. It reached the ears of Kang Min-ho within the week, delivered by a nervous household assistant who clearly hadn't wanted to be the one to say it out loud. He's improving, the assistant said carefully. Significantly. The doctors are surprised. Min-ho's jaw tightened. Improving how? He was supposed to. He caught himself before finishing the sentence, but the assistant's face made it clear the implication had landed anyway. What's causing it? The maid, the assistant admitted reluctantly. Her son. The chairman has taken a liking to the boy. He asks for him every day. Min-ho said nothing for a long moment, his mind working through the implications with the same cold calculation he applied to every business negotiation. A father recovering was inconvenient. A father recovering because of some housekeeper's child was worse than inconvenient. It was unpredictable, and unpredictable things had a way of appending carefully laid plans. He relayed the information to his sister that same night, in the clipped, businesslike tone they both used whenever discussing anything related to their father's health, wealth, or impending mortality. "He's bonding with a servant's kid," Min-ho said, pouring himself a drink in the study he'd essentially claimed as his own since arriving. "It's absurd. He's dying and playing with blocks." Ji-woo, curled in an armchair with her laptop, didn't look up from whatever spreadsheet she was studying. "Does it matter? Let the old man have his fun. It's not like a toddler is going to be in the will." "It matters," Min-ho snapped, "because he's getting better. His doctors think he might have more time than we planned for. Years, maybe." That got her attention. Ji-woo's fingers stilled over the keyboard. "Years. That's what I heard." The siblings stared at each other across the dim study, the unspoken calculation passing between them without needing to be said aloud. Years of waiting. Years of their father's grip on the empire tightening again instead of loosening. Years of watching some maid's toddler occupy the affection they had never bothered, or never known how, to earn for themselves. "We should look into her," Ji-woo said finally, closing her laptop. "The housekeeper. Where she's from, what she wants, why she's really here." "You think she's playing some kind of angle?" Min-ho asked. "I think," Ji-woo said slowly, "that nobody gets this close to our father by accident. And I want to know exactly what she thinks she's going to get out of it." From that night forward, Amina Johnson became a subject of quiet, deliberate scrutiny inside the Kang household, followed not with the obvious clumsiness of amateurs, but with the careful, patient attention of people who had spent their lives learning how to dismantle whoever stood in their way. She had no idea, humming softly to Noah as she tucked him into bed each night in the small staff quarters they'd been given on the property, that she had already become someone's problem to solve. Amina had been a nurse for 6 years before the layoffs forced her into housekeeping, and old instincts, it turned out, didn't disappear just because the job title changed. She still noticed things. The subtle tremor in a patient's hand that meant a medication dose was off, the particular pallor that signaled dehydration before anyone else clocked it, the small inconsistencies that most people walked right past without a second glance. It was those instincts that first made her pause outside Tae-Joon's room one Tuesday evening, listening through the half-open door as one of his private physicians reviewed his chart with a nurse. His numbers were improving all week, the doctor was saying, frustration evident in his tone. And now this. It's like we're back to square one. Did anything change in his medication schedule? Nothing that I administered, the nurse said, defensive. I followed the chart exactly. Amina lingered a moment longer than she should have, an old unease she couldn't quite name settling low in her stomach. Over the following days, she began paying closer attention, not out of nosiness, she told herself, but out of the same protective instinct that had made her a good nurse in the first place. She noticed that Tae-Joon's good days, the days he was alert and laughing with Noah, tracked almost perfectly with certain staff rotations. And his bad days, the days he could barely lift his head off the pillow, always seemed to follow visits from one particular member of the household staff, a quiet, unassuming man named Jang Ho-suk, who had worked for the family for over a decade, and who Amina had rarely seen speak more than a few words to anyone. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself it wasn't her business, that she was a housekeeper with a toddler to protect and a rent payment to make, and that the safest thing she could possibly do was keep her head down and her questions to herself. She told herself that for exactly 4 more days. On the 5th night, unable to sleep, gripped by the same restless instinct that used to pull her out of bed to double-check a patient's chart even on her nights off, Amina slipped quietly out of the staff quarters and made her way toward the small kitchenette near the east wing where medications were prepared for delivery to Tae-Joon's room each evening. She found Jang Ho-suk already there, back turned to the door, carefully measuring liquid from an unmarked bottle into a syringe that was decidedly not part of the labeled medication tray sitting beside him. Amina froze in the doorway, every instinct in her body screaming at her to back away quietly and pretend she'd seen nothing. She didn't move fast enough. Hosuk turned, and for a fraction of a second, something dangerous flickered across his otherwise blank expression before he smoothed it back into practiced neutrality. "Can't sleep?" he asked mildly, setting the syringe down and sliding it, almost casually, beneath a folded cloth. "I was getting water for my son," Amina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He gets thirsty at night." "Of course." Hosuk's eyes lingered on her for a beat too long. "You should be careful, wandering the halls this late. This is a dangerous house for people who see things they shouldn't." It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it wasn't not one either. Amina forced a polite smile, grabbed a bottle of water from the small fridge with hands that were not nearly as steady as she wanted them to be, and left the kitchenette without another word, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it.
She didn't sleep at all that night.
She lay awake beside Noah's small, peacefully sleeping form, replaying the moment over and over, trying to convince herself she'd misread it, that there was some innocent explanation for an unmarked syringe being prepared outside of the official medication schedule. She couldn't convince herself of anything of the sort. The next morning, careful not to be seen, Amina reviewed the medication log that had been left, temporarily unattended, on the counter in the same kitchenette. The doses listed didn't match what she'd witnessed being drawn the night before. Someone was administering something that wasn't on the chart, something that, based on the pattern she'd been quietly tracking for days, correlated directly with Tae-Joon's worst episodes. Someone in this house was making a dying man sicker, and doing it carefully enough that his own doctors hadn't caught it. Her hands shook as she photographed the log with her phone, tucking the evidence away with the same trembling urgency she used to feel reporting a medication error back when she still worked the hospital floor. Back then, reporting a problem meant paperwork and maybe an uncomfortable conversation. Here, in this house, she had no idea what reporting a problem might mean for her job, for her safety, or for Noah. But she thought of Tae-Joon's crooked, genuine smile the day Noah had handed him that dinosaur. She thought about a man so isolated by his own power that a 2-year-old's kindness had done more for his health than every doctor in his employ combined. And she thought about the fact that whoever was doing this clearly wanted him dead before he could recover enough to change something, a will, an inheritance, control of an empire she still barely understood the shape of. She decided, against every instinct telling her to protect herself and disappear, that she couldn't stay silent. She was wrong about how much time she had to decide what to do next. 2 nights later, she found her room had been searched, nothing stolen. Nothing obviously disturbed, but small details wrong enough that only someone who lived in careful, constant vigilance would notice. A drawer not quite closed the way she'd left it. Noah's toys rearranged slightly on the shelf. A folded note slipped beneath her door with no signature, only 4 typed words. "Mind your own business." Amina's blood ran cold. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed that night with the note crumpled in her fist, watching her son sleep, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a housekeeping job. She thought about calling the staffing agency the next morning and telling them she was done, that whatever this household was paying her wasn't worth what she'd just found taped beneath her door. She got as far as dialing the number before she stopped herself, thumb hovering over the call button, and thought instead about Tae-Joon's crooked, disbelieving smile the day Noah handed him that dinosaur, the first time, according to every nurse and staff member in that house, that anyone had seen him smile in over a year. She thought about her own mother, back in Chicago, who had worked 3 jobs some years just to keep food on the table and had never once, not on the worst nights, let Amina see her flinch. "You don't run from hard things, baby," her mother used to say, tucking her into bed in an apartment that never quite stayed warm enough in winter. "You figure out which hard thing is worth staying for." She put the phone down without finishing the call. The next morning, she went about her duties as though nothing had happened, scrubbing floors and folding linens with hands that trembled only slightly, watching every shadow in every hallway a little more carefully than before. She said nothing to Sun-hee about the note. She said nothing to anyone. But she began, quietly, to keep a record of everything, Dates, times, small inconsistencies, photographs taken on her phone when no one was looking, building, piece by careful piece, a case she prayed she would never actually need to use. The following afternoon brought the moment that nearly broke her resolve entirely. Noah, playing near the koi pond in the mansion's rear garden under the supervision of one of the junior staff members while Amina finished her shift, wandered closer to the water's edge than he should have. Pulled, as small children always seem to be, by the flash of orange fish darting beneath the surface. The junior staff member, distracted by her phone for less time than it should have taken for anything to go wrong, looked up just in time to see Noah's small foot slip on the mossy stone edge. He would have gone straight into the deep end of the pond had one of the security guards, patrolling nearby out of habit rather than assignment, not lunged forward and caught the back of his shirt at the last possible second, yanking him back onto solid ground as Noah shrieked in startled confusion rather than fear. By the time Amina arrived, sprinting across the garden with her heart in her throat after being alerted by frantic staff, Noah was already laughing again, delighted by the unexpected excitement of nearly falling in with the fish, entirely unaware of how close he'd come to something far worse. Amina was not so unaware. She dropped to her knees and pulled her son into her arms, shaking, and looked up at the mossy stone edge, a border that had been perfectly stable and well-maintained every single day since she'd arrived, and noticed, with a cold clarity that made her stomach drop, that the stone directly where Noah had stood had been recently loosened, deliberately, in a way that no natural wear would explain. "I quit," she said that same evening, standing in Sun-hee's small office with Noah asleep against her shoulder, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury and fear in equal measure. "Effective immediately. I need my final pay, and then we're leaving tonight." Sun-hee, to her credit, did not argue or ask why, though something in her expression suggested she suspected far more than she was willing to say aloud. "I'll have everything processed within the hour," she said quietly. Amina was halfway through packing their few belongings into a single duffel bag when a soft, deliberate knock sounded at her door. She opened it expecting Sun-hee with a final paycheck. Instead, she found Kang Tae-Joon himself standing in her doorway, upright without a wheelchair for the first time she'd ever seen, leaning heavily on a cane, flanked by two guards who kept a respectful distance behind him. "I heard you're leaving," he said, his voice slow but clear. "Yes, sir," Amina said, surprised into formality. "I think it's best. For both of us." "Because of the pond," he said. "Not a question." Amina's grip tightened on the strap of her duffel bag. "Because I have a son to protect, and I don't understand what's happening in this house, and I don't think it's safe for either of us to stay and find out." Tae-Joon was quiet for a long moment, his tired eyes moving past her to where Noah slept, curled and small, on the narrow bed. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual formal distance. "I have not felt like a person in this house in over a year," he said. "Not a chairman. Not a target. Not a dying man waiting for his own children to finish the job someone else started. A person. Your son looked at me and saw a lonely old man who needed a friend, not an empire to inherit or a threat to eliminate." He paused, jaw tightening against whatever emotion was working its way up through decades of practice control. "I am asking you, not ordering, asking to stay. Not as staff. As his caregiver. I will pay you whatever you require. I will move you and your son into secure quarters within the main house, under guard, day and night. I will not let anything happen to either of you." "With respect, sir," Amina said carefully, "someone in this house is trying to kill you, and I think they've noticed that my son's visits are the reason you're getting better. That makes both of us targets, whether we want to be or not." "I know," Tae-Joon said grimly. "Which is exactly why I need you to stay, so that I can find out who it is before they succeed. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, that's exactly where I want you. Hit like, drop a comment telling me who you think is behind the poisoning, and let's keep going, because the truth is about to blow this entire family apart." She should have said no. Every rational part of her screamed that the smart, responsible thing to do was pack Noah into the car and never look back at that mansion again. But she thought about the loosened stone at the pond's edge, deliberate and precise, and understood with sudden clarity that leaving didn't guarantee safety either, Not if whoever was behind it decided a witness who knew too much was more dangerous free than contained. And beneath the fear, something else stirred, something she recognized from every shift she'd ever worked as a nurse, the simple, stubborn refusal to walk away from someone who needed help just because helping them was hard. "I'll stay," she said finally, "but I want everything in writing. Security around my son at all times. And I want to know exactly what I'm walking into." Tae-Joon nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Why does it matter so much to you?" Amina asked, unable to stop herself. "I've worked in this house for weeks. I'm a housekeeper. There are 100 people you could hire to look after you, who wouldn't come with the complications I bring." Tae-Joon was quiet for a long moment, leaning more heavily on his cane than he probably wanted her to notice. "Do you know what it is like," he said finally, "to have more money than several small nations and not one single person in your life who wants anything from you besides that money?" He looked past her, toward the room where Noah slept, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation happening just beyond the door. "Your son does not know what I am worth. He does not know what I have done to become worth it. He only knows that I was sad, and he decided, for no reason at all, that he wanted to fix that. I have not been given a gift with no strings attached in longer than I can remember. I am not eager to lose that so quickly." Amina felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, at the raw honesty in his voice, the same kind of honesty she imagined he rarely allowed himself, let alone anyone else. "Okay," she said softly. "Then we'll figure this out. Together." "Together," Tae-Joon repeated, testing the word the way he seemed to test every unfamiliar kindness that had entered his life since the day a toddler wandered into his room uninvited. That night marked a turning point the household would spend years discussing in hushed tones. Amina and Noah were moved into a secure suite adjacent to Tae-Joon's own chambers, guarded around the clock by men personally vetted and reassigned by Tae-Joon himself, men whose loyalty predated his children's involvement in the business by decades. Sun-hee, initially cool toward the arrangement, found herself quietly grateful for an ally inside a house increasingly divided against itself. Meanwhile, an elderly household retainer named Oh Byung-joon, who had served the Kang family even longer than Sun-hee and possessed a memory sharper than men half his age, found himself unable to shake a nagging familiarity every time he heard Amina's surname mentioned around the estate. Johnson. It meant nothing to most people in that house. But Byung-joon had lived through the family's history in a way few of the current staff had, and something about the name pulled at a memory buried nearly 3 decades deep. He began, quietly and without telling anyone, searching through the estate's oldest records, dusty filing cabinets in a basement archive that hadn't been properly organized since before Tae-Joon's own father had run the family business. Late into several nights, by the light of a single desk lamp, he pored over decades-old documents, incident reports, and one particular file that made his breath catch when he finally found it, buried near the bottom of a box marked simply with a date 28 years in the past. He said nothing to anyone yet, not until he was certain. Meanwhile, tension in the house continued to build. With Amina now installed as Tae-Joon's official caregiver, working directly alongside his medical team, Kang Min-ho and Kang Ji-woo grew increasingly desperate, their carefully laid plans for their father's decline unraveling faster than they could adjust. Do-yoon, the youngest, growing paranoid that his own quiet dealings with rival syndicates might be exposed now that his father's mind was sharpening again, began pushing his siblings toward more drastic action. "We're running out of time," Do-yoon said one evening. The 3 siblings gathered once again in the study, voices lowered despite the thick walls. "If he recovers fully, if he finds out what any of us have been doing." "He won't find out anything," Min-ho said, though his confidence sounded thinner than it had weeks earlier. "As long as Ho-suk keeps doing his job." "Ho-suk almost got caught," Ji-woo snapped. "The maid saw something. That's why father moved her and her brat into secured quarters. He suspects." "Then we accelerate the timeline," Do-yoon said, his voice dropping even lower. "Before he changes the will. Before he can freeze any of our accounts or cut us out entirely." A heavy silence fell over the room, the unspoken suggestion hanging in the air between them. the same silent understanding that had been building for weeks, that some lines, once crossed by their father in building his empire, might now need to be crossed against him in order to keep it. What about the maid? Do-yoon asked suddenly, voice tight. If something happens to him, and she starts talking about what she's seen, she won't have anything to talk about, Min-ho said, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice that made even his siblings go quiet for a moment. Ho-suk already gave her a warning. If she doesn't take the hint, we'll make sure she understands more permanently. That's her son at the pond, wasn't it? Ji-woo said slowly, something like realization dawning across her face. That was you. I made sure it looked like an accident, Min-ho said, unbothered. It would have solved several problems at once. Do-yoon's face paled. Solved problems? Min-ho, it's a toddler. It's a liability, Min-ho corrected coldly. The same as anyone else standing between us and what's ours. None of them noticed the study door was not quite fully closed. None of them noticed their father, walking the halls that evening with far more strength in his legs than anyone had accounted for, pausing just outside, listening to every word. Kang Tae-Joon stood frozen in the hallway outside his own study, one hand braced against the wall, as he absorbed the full weight of what he was hearing. Not rumor, not suspicion, but his own children's voices, calmly discussing accelerating his death before he could interfere with their inheritance. He had built this empire with his own hands, clawed his way up from nothing through violence and fear and a ruthlessness he had never fully apologized for, and he had told himself for years that it was all for them, for his children, so that they would never know the poverty and desperation that had defined his own youth. Instead, he had raised 3 people who saw him not as a father, but as an obstacle standing between them and everything they believed they deserved. He did not confront them that night. He returned to his room in silence, sat in the darkness for hours without speaking a word to the nurses who checked on him periodically, running through 30 years of memory in search of the exact moment he had lost his children to the empire he built for them. He remembered Min-ho at 8 years old, proudly presenting a school drawing of his father as a superhero, cape and all, and Tae-Joon, too consumed by a territorial dispute that week, barely glancing at it before handing it off to an assistant to put somewhere. He remembered Ji-woo's high school graduation, which he had missed entirely due to a meeting he could have rescheduled and chose not to. He remembered Do-yoon's first and only attempt at a legitimate business venture in his early 20s, quietly and completely undermined by Min-ho out of some sibling rivalry Tae-Joon had never bothered to intervene in, because intervening would have required paying closer attention than he was willing to spare. He had told himself, every time, that there would be time later, that the empire needed tending now, and the relationships could be repaired once he had built something secure enough to hand down. He understood now, in the hollow silence of that long night, that he had spent 30 years mistaking presence for love and mistaking money for both. By morning, something in him had shifted, not weaker, but colder, more resolved than he had been in years. "Call my lawyers," he told Amina the next morning, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been since the ambush. "All of them. Today." "Are you all right?" Amina asked, alarmed by the sudden intensity in his expression. "I heard my children last night," Tae-Joon said simply. "Planning my death. Discussing it the way one discusses a business quarter that isn't performing to expectations." He looked at her, something almost like gratitude passing behind his tired eyes. "Your son taught me more about what a family should be in 3 weeks than mine did in 30 years. I intend to make sure that whatever I leave behind reflects that lesson, not the mistakes I made building an empire on fear." Over the following days, working with a small team of lawyers he trusted implicitly, men who had known him since before the empire existed, before the violence, before the fear he'd built his name on, Tae-Joon began quietly dismantling decades of criminal infrastructure. Legitimate businesses that had long served as fronts for less legal operations were restructured into an independent charitable foundation. Funds that his children believed were earmarked for their inheritance began flowing, quietly and irreversibly, toward hospital funding, scholarship programs for underprivileged families, and, in a decision that would later mean more to Amina than any amount of money ever could, services specifically designed to support families harmed by organized crime, the very industry that had built his fortune. His children had no idea any of it was happening until it was already too late to stop. Meanwhile, Byung-joon finally found what he had been searching for. The file was old, its paper yellowed and fragile, dated to a violent territorial conflict that had erupted between rival factions nearly 3 decades earlier, a conflict Tae-Joon himself had been at the center of, back when he was still clawing his way up the ranks rather than sitting atop them. The report detailed an evacuation of civilians from a building caught in the crossfire, an operation Tae-Joon had ordered against the explicit wishes of his own superiors at the time, insisting that innocent bystanders be pulled to safety before the conflict escalated further. Among the names listed in the evacuation report was a young African-American woman visiting Seoul, caught in the chaos while several months pregnant. The report noted that she had gone into early, traumatic labor during the evacuation itself, delivering her baby in the back of a rescue vehicle under the care of medics Tae-Joon had personally ordered to the scene. The baby girl's name, scrawled in the corner of a follow-up medical note attached to the file, made Byung-joon's hands go cold as he read it. Amina. He sat in the dim basement archive for a long time after that, the old file trembling slightly in his weathered hands, understanding with a mixture of awe and disbelief the impossible circle that had somehow closed itself in this house without a single person involved ever realizing it. The man Amina had unknowingly saved through her son's kindness was the very same man who had unknowingly saved her 28 years earlier, before either of them had any understanding of who the other would someday become. He brought the file to Tae-Joon that same evening, his hands still unsteady as he laid it open on the desk before him. Tae-Joon read the report slowly, his expression shifting through confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like shock, as the pieces assembled themselves in his mind. This is... He looked up at Byung-joon, voice barely above a whisper. This is her. This is Amina. I believe so, sir, Byung-joon said quietly. The dates align. Her age aligns. I ran what checks I could discreetly. Her mother's name matches the woman in this report. Tae-Joon sat back in his chair, staring at the faded document like it might dissolve if he looked away, the weight of 30 years settling over him in a single overwhelming instant. He had ordered that evacuation on instinct. On some flicker of humanity, he'd rarely allowed himself to indulge in the ruthless years of building his empire, never imagining that the tiny, screaming infant pulled to safety that night would grow up an ocean away and eventually walk back into his life, unknowingly, to save him a second time. Does she know? He asked.
No, sir.
I don't believe she has any idea. Tae-Joon was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing the edge of the old report. Not yet, he said finally. Let me find the right way to tell her. Before he had the chance, the entire fragile balance of the household collapsed in a single, chaotic evening that none of them saw coming. It began with a routine dinner, one of the rare occasions the entire family gathered under the same roof, ostensibly to discuss family matters, but really, everyone understood, to negotiate the terms of an inheritance battle none of them were willing to say aloud. Tae-Joon, stronger now than he had been in months, sat at the head of the long table, watching his children with new, clear-eyed understanding of exactly who they had become. I've made some changes to the estate, he announced partway through the meal, his voice calm and even. Effective immediately. Minho set down his chopstick slowly. What kind of changes? The businesses are being restructured. Assets redirected. Tae-Joon met each of his children's eyes in turn, watching the color drain from their faces as understanding began to dawn. I've established a foundation. Hospitals, scholarships, restitution funds for families affected by the industry that built this house. The empire, as you knew it, no longer exists. Silence fell over the table like a physical weight. You're lying, Ji-woo said finally, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. You wouldn't. I would, and I have, Tae-Joon said flatly. I heard you, all 3 of you, in the study, planning to accelerate my death before I could interfere with your inheritance. He watched his children's faces cycle through shock, then panic, then a desperate scramble for denial that none of them could quite manage to voice. You built your futures on the assumption that I would die quietly and leave you everything I built through violence and fear. I've decided that legacy ends with me. You can't do this, Min-ho said, standing so abruptly his chair scraped violently against the floor. Everything we've done, everything this family has built, Tae-Joon interrupted, his voice rising for the first time in longer than anyone at that table could remember, was built on the suffering of people who never had a choice in the matter. I built it to protect you. Instead, I raised children who are willing to kill their own father for a bigger piece of it. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable, unanswerable. Do-yoon, the youngest, looked down at his plate, unable to meet his father's eyes. Ji-woo's jaw tightened, fury and something that might have been shame warring across her face. Min-ho, cornered and desperate, made the mistake that would ultimately end whatever remained of his standing in the family entirely. It's the housekeeper, he snapped. She's manipulated you. Her and that child. You're not thinking clearly, you're. I am thinking more clearly than I have in 30 years, Tae-Joon said, cutting him off with a coldness that silenced the entire table. And I know exactly what's been happening to my medication. I know someone in this house has been poisoning me, slowly, carefully, hoping it would look like natural decline. I intend to find out precisely who. Min-ho's face went white. That single flicker of panic was all the confirmation Amina needed, watching quietly from where she stood near the door with the evidence she'd been carefully compiling for weeks. Photographs of the unlogged medications, timestamps that correlated perfectly with Tae-Joon's worst episodes, and a recorded conversation she'd captured just days earlier, when Jang Ho-suk, believing himself alone in the medication room, had made a phone call to someone he addressed only as Sir, confirming that the adjustment to the dosage had been administered as instructed. She stepped forward, evidence in hand, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the room. I have proof, she said simply. I've had it for weeks. I was waiting for the right moment to bring it forward safely. All eyes turned to her. Min-ho's expression cycled rapidly from fury to calculation to something that looked disturbingly close to fear. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I know that someone tried to hurt my son to keep me quiet. Amina shot back, years of accumulated fear finally boiling over into something closer to anger. I know that someone has been poisoning a dying man while pretending to care for him. And I know that whatever happens to me next, I'm not staying silent about either one. Tae-Joon rose from his seat, slower than he would have liked, but with a strength that surprised everyone at the table, and extended his hand toward Amina. She crossed the room and placed the folder of evidence directly into his palm. He opened it, reviewed it in silence for what felt like an eternity, and then looked up at his eldest son with an expression of such profound, exhausted disappointment that Min-ho actually flinched. You can't just throw us out, Ji-woo said, though the fight in her voice had already begun to crumble under the weight of the evidence spread across the table. We're your children. You are my children, Tae-Joon said, his voice quiet now, which was somehow worse than the shouting. Tonight, I heard exactly what that means to you. I heard you discuss my death like a line item on a balance sheet. I heard, his voice caught, just slightly before he forced it steady again. I heard that my own son ordered a 2-year-old child pushed into a pond to eliminate what he called a liability. The color drained entirely from Min-ho's face. Do-yoon's eyes flicked toward the door, as if calculating how quickly he could leave the room. That's not, Min-ho started. Do not, Tae-Joon said, and something in his voice, some remnant of the man who had built an empire through sheer force of will, silenced his son instantly. Do not lie to me again tonight. I have heard enough lies from this family to last several lifetimes. He looked around the table at each of his children in turn. Min-ho, rigid with barely suppressed panic. Ji-woo, her composure finally cracking into something that looked almost like grief. Do-yoon, staring at his plate, unable to lift his eyes to meet his father's. For a moment, something in Tae-Joon's expression softened, some final flicker of the hope every parent carries that it isn't too late, that there is still some version of this family worth salvaging. Then it passed. Get out, Tae-Joon said quietly. All of you.
Now.
We're getting close to the truth now. And trust me, what comes next is going to hit you right in the heart. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where this story goes. The fallout came swiftly, and without mercy. Within 48 hours, the evidence Amina had gathered, combined with additional financial records Tae-Joon's lawyers uncovered once given full authority to investigate, was turned over to authorities through carefully arranged legal channels designed to protect the family's legitimate assets while ensuring the guilty faced consequences. Jang Ho-suk was arrested at the estate itself, his composed facade finally cracking as investigators led him away, confirming under interrogation what everyone had already suspected. Min-ho had orchestrated the slow poisoning, desperate to secure his inheritance before his father's declining health could be reversed or his will altered. Min-ho was arrested 3 days later, his carefully maintained image of the dutiful, concerned eldest son collapsing entirely under the weight of financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from staff members who had grown tired of protecting a family that had never once protected them in return. Ji-woo and Do-yoon, though not directly implicated in the poisoning itself, found themselves stripped of any remaining claim to their father's trust or his restructured fortune, their attempts at damage control falling on ears that had finally, after 30 years, stopped listening. Do-yoon came to the estate once more, alone, several days after his brother's arrest, standing awkwardly in the doorway of his father's study, with none of the confidence he usually carried. "I didn't know," he said quietly, "about the pond, about Noah. I swear to you, Father, I didn't know what Min-ho was planning until it had already happened." Tae-Joon studied his youngest son for a long moment, weighing the words against 30 years of watching all three of his children learn, in different ways, to prioritize the empire over each other and over him. "But you knew about the medication," he said. "You knew someone was making me sicker, and you said nothing, because a part of you was waiting to see if it would work." Do-yoon didn't answer, which was answer enough. "I am not cutting you off out of cruelty," Tae-Joon said finally, his voice softer than Do-yoon had expected. "I am cutting you off because the only way you will ever learn to build something honest is if you are no longer able to inherit something built on lies. There is a place for you at the foundation if you want it. Not as an heir. As someone willing to start over. The same as anyone else who walks through those doors looking for a second chance." Do-yoon left without answering, and it would be several more months before he returned to take his father up on the offer. Quietly, without fanfare, starting at the bottom of an organization he had once assumed would simply be handed to him. Tae-Joon did not celebrate the arrests. He stood at the window of his study the evening Min-ho was taken into custody, watching the police vehicles disappear down the long driveway, and felt not vindication, but a profound, hollow grief for the family he had built and lost simultaneously through the same choices. "I spent 30 years building an empire to protect them," he said quietly, more to himself than to Amina, who stood nearby, uncertain whether her presence was welcome in a moment so heavy with loss. "And I never once stopped to ask whether the empire itself was the thing hurting them." "You're doing something about it now," Amina offered gently. "That has to count for something, perhaps." He was quiet for a long moment before turning to face her fully, an expression on his face she hadn't seen before, nervous, almost, in a way that seemed entirely foreign on a man who had spent decades projecting nothing but absolute control. "There's something I need to tell you. Something Byung-joon discovered, going through old records." He told her everything then. The evacuation 28 years earlier, the young pregnant woman caught in the crossfire of a conflict Tae-Joon himself had been a part of, the emergency delivery in the back of a rescue vehicle he had personally ordered to the scene against his own superior's wishes. He watched Amina's face carefully as he spoke, searching for some flicker of recognition, though he knew, realistically, that she would have no memory of an event that occurred within moments of her birth. Amina sat very still throughout the entire account, her mind racing back to stories her mother had told her sparingly over the years, fragmented, painful memories of a trip to Korea that had nearly cost both their lives, of being pulled from danger by men she'd never been able to properly thank because she never learned their names. "My mother talked about that night," Amina finally said, her voice unsteady. "Not often. It was hard for her. But she always said someone saved us. She never knew who. It was me, Tae-Joon said quietly. I gave the order. I didn't know your name, didn't know what became of either of you, until Byung-Joon found the file weeks ago. Amina sat with that revelation for a long moment, the impossible symmetry of it settling over her slowly, that the man she had spent weeks fearing might be the source of every threat surrounding her and her son was, 28 years earlier, the reason she had a life at all. That her own son's innocent kindness had, in some strange and beautiful way, repaid a debt neither of them had ever known existed. I don't know what to say, she admitted finally, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. You don't need to say anything, Tae-Joon said, his own voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. You've already given me more than I ever gave you. You brought your son into a house full of people who saw me as an obstacle or an inheritance, and he saw a lonely old man who simply needed someone to care. That is a debt I could never repay, even with everything I have left. Can I ask you something? Amina said after a long silence, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. That night, the evacuation. Why did you do it? From what I understand about who you were back then, saving strangers wasn't exactly good for business. Tae-Joon considered the question for a long moment, turning it over the way he turned over most things now, slowly and carefully, as though the illness had taught him to stop rushing toward answers. I grew up with nothing, he said finally. My mother died when I was young. My father was not a good man, and the streets raised me after that, the same way they raised most of the men I eventually came to lead. By the time that conflict happened, I had already done things I am not proud of. Things I have spent very little of my life examining honestly because it was easier not to. He paused. But that night, I saw a pregnant woman caught in the middle of violence that had nothing to do with her, that she never chose to be part of, and something in me, some small, stubborn piece I thought the streets had killed off entirely, refused to let it happen without at least trying to stop it. I told myself it was strategy. That civilian casualties would draw unwanted police attention. It was easier to believe that than to admit I still had a conscience left somewhere underneath everything I'd built on top of it. Maybe that conscience is the reason you're still here, Amina said quietly. Maybe it's the reason Noah found his way to you in the first place. Tae-Joon looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes. Maybe, he said finally. I've spent 30 years believing that fear was the only language this world respects. I am beginning to think I was wrong about a great many things. The weeks that followed brought a transformation to the Kang estate more profound than anyone could have predicted. With the criminal network he had spent decades building now fully dismantled, its loyal members either transitioning into the legitimate businesses that remained or walking away entirely once the illegal operations that had sustained them dissolved, the mansion that had once echoed with quiet menace and whispered threats slowly, steadily, became something else entirely. The armed guards that once patrolled every hallway were reduced to a small, necessary security detail, focused now on genuine safety rather than enforcing fear. The East Wing that staff had once been warned never to enter was renovated into administrative offices for the newly established Kang Foundation, its walls lined not with locked filing cabinets of illicit business dealings, but with photographs of the hospitals being funded, the scholarship recipients whose lives were being changed, the community programs slowly repairing decades of harm the family's criminal empire had caused. Amina found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, at the center of much of this transformation. Her nursing background, combined with the trust Tae-Joon had placed in her, led naturally into overseeing several of the Foundation's community health initiatives, programs providing medical care and support to families affected by organized crime violence, the very kind of families she herself might have belonged to had circumstances gone even slightly differently 28 years earlier. 6 months after that chaotic dinner that had shattered the Kang family and rebuilt something entirely new in its place, the mansion looked almost unrecognizable from the fortress of fear it had once been. Children from the Foundation's community programs played in the gardens where armed guards once stood watch. The koi pond, its loosened stone long since repaired, had become a favorite spot for the Foundation's youngest visitors to feed the fish under careful supervision. And on a warm afternoon in early autumn, the mansion's grand dining hall was decorated not for a tense family negotiation, but for the third birthday of a small boy who had once wandered, uninvited and unafraid, into the private chambers of a man everyone else in Seoul had learned to fear. Kang Tae-Joon arrived at the party leaning only lightly on his cane now, his color returned, his hand steady enough to carry the carefully wrapped gift he'd insisted on presenting personally. Noah, spotting him from across the room, abandoned whatever game he'd been playing with the other children and sprinted toward him with the reckless enthusiasm only a toddler on the cusp of turning 3 could muster. "You came?" Noah shrieked, throwing his arms around Tae-Joon's legs with such force the old man nearly lost his balance, though the smile on his face suggested he wouldn't have minded falling over entirely if it meant not letting go of this moment. "Of course I came," Tae-Joon said, crouching down slowly, carefully, to be at eye level with the boy. "I have something for you." He handed over the carefully wrapped gift, watching with quiet delight as Noah tore through the paper with the same reckless enthusiasm he approached everything in life. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was the same plastic dinosaur toy Noah had gifted Tae-Joon all those months ago, repaired now, its once broken tail carefully restored by a specialist Tae-Joon had personally sought out after Noah accidentally snapped it during an enthusiastic play session weeks earlier. Noah's eyes went wide with recognition and delight. "You fixed him." "I did," Tae-Joon said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "He helped me when I needed him most. It seemed only right to return the favor." Noah threw his arms around the old man's neck with the same fearless, uncomplicated affection he'd shown from the very first day they'd met. "Grandpa," he said simply, the word landing in the room with a weight that silenced every conversation nearby. Amina, watching from a few feet away with tears she made no effort to hide, saw Tae-Joon's entire body still at the word, saw decades of accumulated loneliness and grief and hard-won power give way, for just a moment, to something so simple and so profound that it seemed to erase, briefly, every hard year that had come before it. "Grandpa," Tae-Joon repeated softly, testing the word the same way he'd once tested the weight of a small plastic toy pressed into his trembling hand.
Yes.
"I would like that very much." The party continued around them, laughter and celebration filling a mansion that had spent decades echoing with far darker sounds. Byung-joon watched from near the doorway with quiet satisfaction, the old file that had unlocked this impossible reunion long since returned to its place in the archive, its purpose finally, fully served. Sun-hee, standing nearby with a rare, genuine smile on her face, found herself thinking that she had worked in this house for over 20 years and had never once seen it filled with a happiness so entirely unforced. As the afternoon light softened into evening, Tae-Joon settled into a chair near the garden, watching Amina and Noah laugh together over a half-eaten slice of birthday cake, and allowed himself, for the first time in his life, to simply exist in a moment without calculating its cost or its consequence. He had spent 30 years believing that power was the only currency worth accumulating, that fear, wielded correctly, could build an empire strong enough to protect everything and everyone he cared about. He understood now, sitting in a garden that had once been patrolled by armed guards and was now filled with children's laughter, that he had been wrong in the most fundamental way a man could be wrong. Fear had built him an empire. It had never once built him a family. Kindness, small, unassuming, entirely without agenda, offered freely by a child who understood nothing about power or money or 30 years of carefully cultivated fear, had given him something no empire ever could. He watched Noah run circles around his mother, dinosaur toy clutched triumphantly in one small fist, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and completely at peace. Power, he thought, could command obedience. Only kindness could earn love. And there, in a mansion once ruled by fear and now filled with the sound of a child's laughter, Kang Tae-Joon finally understood the difference between the two. Later that evening, once most of the guests had gone and only a handful of close staff remained to help clear away the last of the party, Amina found Tae-Joon still sitting in the garden, the crayon drawing of 3 overlapping circles resting carefully in his lap, having been carried outside at some point during the celebration and never quite made it back to the wall. "Tired?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. "Content," he corrected, with the small, crooked smile that had become so familiar to her over the past 6 months, the same smile Noah had first coaxed out of him with nothing more than a plastic dinosaur and an honest question. "There is a difference I've learned. I spent most of my life exhausted and calling it purpose. This is the first time in longer than I can remember that stillness has felt like enough." Amina looked out at the garden, at the koi pond glinting gold and orange in the last of the evening light, at the foundation's newest interns packing away decorations while laughing about something one of the children had said earlier. It was hard to reconcile this place with the fortress of fear she'd walked into all those months ago, gripping Noah's small hand a little too tightly, certain she'd made some terrible mistake taking a job she barely understood in a house that felt more like a warning than a home. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "The day I got that message from the staffing agency, I almost didn't call. Something about it felt wrong. I don't know if it was instinct or desperation talking louder than instinct, but I almost let the whole thing go." "What made you call?" Tae-Joon asked. "Rent was due in 11 days, Amina admitted, laughing a little at how small and practical the truth of it sounded now, set against everything that had happened since. "I didn't have a choice. Or I thought I didn't. Looking back, I think maybe I did have a choice, and some part of me made it anyway because I needed to believe things could still turn out okay if I just kept showing up." "I am glad you kept showing up," Tae-Joon said simply. "Me too," Amina said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade behind the hills, listening to Noah's distant laughter as he chased one of the foundation interns around the garden with his newly repaired dinosaur held high above his head like a trophy. "I want to ask you something," Tae-Joon said eventually, his voice carrying a hesitance she hadn't heard from him since the earliest days of their acquaintance. "You and Noah have quarters here now, but I know that was meant to be temporary, for your safety, while the investigation concluded. I would like to make a different arrangement if you're willing to consider it. Something permanent." Amina turned to look at him, surprised. "What kind of arrangement?" "A home," Tae-Joon said. "Not staff quarters. Not a temporary safe house. A home, here, for as long as you and Noah want it, for as many years as I have left to share it with you. I am not asking as your employer. I do not think I have been your employer in any real sense for quite some time now. I am asking as..." He paused, searching for the word. "As family. Which is, I suspect, what we have already become to each other, whether either of us intended it or not." Amina felt her throat tighten, the events of the past 6 months rising up all at once. The fear, the exhaustion, the impossible weight of raising a child alone in a foreign city with no safety net beneath her, and then this, an old man in a garden, offering her something she hadn't realized she'd been searching for since long before she ever set foot in this mansion. "Noah already calls you Grandpa," she said, voice thick. "I think he made that decision a long time before either of us caught up to it. Then perhaps it's time the rest of us stopped pretending we hadn't noticed," Tae-Joon said, and for the second time that day, Amina watched tears gather in the eyes of a man once feared across an entire city, tears that had nothing to do with illness or loss, and everything to do with the strange, undeserved gift of finding a family exactly where he'd least expected one. Noah came barreling across the lawn a moment later, breathless and grinning, and climbed without hesitation into his grandfather's lap, dinosaur toy pressed between them, utterly unaware of the quiet, life-altering conversation he had just interrupted, and entirely unbothered by it even after Amina explained, through happy tears, exactly what it meant. "Does this mean I get to visit every day?" Noah asked, his small face scrunched in serious consideration of the logistics. "Every day," Tae-Joon promised. "For as long as I have breath to enjoy it." "Good," Noah said decisively, settling back against him with the easy, unshakable confidence of a child who had never once doubted. From the very first afternoon he wandered uninvited into a forbidden room, that this was exactly where he belonged. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me putting it together, do me a favor. Smash that like button, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe if you haven't already, because we've got so many more stories like this one coming your way. Thank you for watching until the very end. I'll see you in the next story.